Welcome, everyone, to our first 2021 She Sports Switzerland webinar. And I'm very happy to be joined tonight here today in the States by Stephanie Jackson. Just quickly, so She Sports, what is She Sports Switzerland? So we are a non-profit organization, voluntary led and run. We're supporting women and men in the sports industry and championing an equitable and diverse work environment. And we hope that we can create awareness about the huge potential a diverse team has to offer, and are always happy to welcome anybody who works in the sports industry and is committed to supporting and empowering women in business, but also in women's sports. So today's topic is about brands and authenticity, stereotypes, and we put the title a little provoking maybe, that maybe the sports industry is compelled to a rethink by its sponsors. And I'm very happy that Stephanie Jackson is with me today. And Stephanie is Director of Diversity and Inclusion at USA Hockey and has a tremendous work life in the matter of diversity and sustainability and inclusion. So previously, Stephanie, you worked at Nike as like diversity and inclusion communications department. You worked at the BBC and you worked also for the international tax advisory consultancy KPMG. So very warm welcome to you. And
yes, hi Marisa. Good morning to everyone here in the United States of America, and good day to everyone all across the world. So thank you so much, Marisa, for having me.
Yeah, and we promised to have another person with us, and unfortunately, she has Anne-Catherine from Lübbecke from Sport 5. She has a private emergency. So, and I think nowadays we all know how important health is, and so that's why we're sad that we don't have her here in our conversation, but we hope that everything goes well, and good luck over to Hamburg, where she is now. And but that doesn't matter. We will do that another time then with Anne-Catherine. And now we are us two. And I really am interested, Stephanie. You have worked for so many companies, you know, and brands, and with BBC broadcasting, and now with USA Hockey. And I'm sure you got to know quite a lot of different company cultures, values, perspectives when it comes to the matter of diversity. And I would like to know, or to start with, you know, what is the main difference for you when you compare a corporate, like for example Nike, with a nonprofit federation like USA Hockey?
Yeah, that's definitely a good question, Marisa. I think sometimes the value structures are different. Of course, the business bottom lines are different. The outcomes also for which the organization wants to achieve is very different. I would like to say that sometimes, you know, nonprofits do have a very humble, roll up your sleeve kind of environment. But at the end of the day, they are still businesses as well. Maybe the value is not a cash flow or a cash stream like it is for a bigger corporate conglomerate. So those are kind of immediate differences that you can see when you move from the more private sector into a more public and accountability sector. But I think when you look at just the landscape of the marketplace, I think that's where you really get to see the differences. The consumers of bigger corporate conglomerates that sell a product demand a little bit more from the brand. Whereas when you have a nonprofit, sometimes the demand is different. But what we are seeing in our current climate is that the consumer is now demanding the same thing across the board. So I would say that maybe now is a time where a lot of nonprofits are starting to rethink their own value structure and their own value proposition, as big corporate conglomerates have done for decades, and they're starting to figure out ways that they can service their communities, as well as their consumer base, a lot more than they have in the past. So I would say that those are some of the biggest differences from moving from the corporate sector into the more public sector that is a nonprofit.
Mhm. At Nike, for example, you designed and executed diversity and inclusion strategies for employees, but you also worked and advised with senior leaders and executives on diversity and inclusion matters, or initiatives. So what do you think is the biggest learning you could take from them, and actually how is it to apply now your expertise to a nonprofit?
Yeah, I think that once again, alongside just the value structure and the value of the organization, sometimes can be a little bit different. But I think that for me, it's just about learning development. I think sometimes people have a misconception that as you go up the chain, executives are just these all knowing people, they know everything. And I think that it doesn't really matter whether you are in a big corporate setting or a nonprofit setting. Sometimes executives, they don't know what they don't know, just like a lot of other people. So it really starts with educating executives about the different things that are going on in the marketplace. And so whenever I say the marketplace, I'm saying that the marketplace is any place where the consumer is. So that is everything that's going on in our environment, everything that's going on socially, how we govern different pockets of our lives. Sometimes educating executives on those very things are important so that you can help executives build their bottom line to meet the demands of the new generation. So I would say that learning development is the thread that I've taken from corporate life now even into nonprofit life. So a large part of my role as director of diversity and inclusion is educating people, and it's educating people on what they know, but also educating people on what they don't know, and providing a safe space for people to not only be themselves, but to also challenge themselves to be better and to be very different than maybe what they were the day before. So being a part of that evolution and that learning process for people is very, very, very important. And I will say I first got my own experience in doing that with executives in the corporate field, but now in nonprofit, I would say it's just the same. It's just maybe the set and the setting and the structure is different, but the core competencies of diversity, equity, and inclusion, it starts with learning development. And so those are things that I take from my corporate life now into nonprofit.
Yeah, absolutely. I can relate to that. I mean, I also worked in the agency space and also worked with a lot of federations. And I think it is just the matter of, you need to realize what is there. And if you're in your own bubble, it's sometimes harder to actually see what's out there. And I think the educational part plays a big, big role, and also allowing time, changing behavior or changing perceptions is, I think, a long process, and it needs time, and it needs also a humble hand to do. You don't come in with a hammer or saw. It's a really gentle process, and I think it's important that it starts at one point in some way. And I think also the companies which maybe pivoted the whole diversity and inclusion movement, I think they also started. I mean, when I remember from the outside, like I was a track and field agent back in the days, yeah, also with a lot of US athletes, and I know Nike very well from that side, and they had a steep learning curve, I think, when it comes to inclusion, to diversity, and they have learned from the past, but they also realized that they need to change and really act upon what is happening. And And I think you can probably relate that in that world, it's much faster because they have to. You just mentioned the consumer has much more power nowadays. Yeah. And when you're selling goods, the consumer is the ultima ratio out there. In the sports, it's more diverse, the income streams. Yeah. It's not just one. And I think that is maybe something federations or clubs can also learn from corporates or from brands to become more agile, more open-minded, more yeah, faster in their decision making.
Yeah.
And I remember that you mentioned at one point, you know, the biggest learning at Nike is, and I have a lot of friends at Nike and athletes, and when you see also their campaigns, you know, it's never dream too little, like dream big, right?
Mm-hmm.
What did you learn also from that perception of, you know, that the sky is the limit?
Yeah, it's about challenging the impossible, right? And I think that through sport shows us what is possible, which is why sport is so special. So I think that it doesn't matter what space you're in, thinking big about your own transformation, whether it is your transformation with diversity or really just your transformation with change in general. Not putting yourself in a small box is going to be very, very, very important to your growth. And so that is one of the things that I have taken from my previous experiences that I bring now to the setting of USA Hockey, which is a nonprofit. We are going through our own transformation and we are challenging ourselves every day to not think in the same box that maybe we were thinking in 20, 30, or 40 years ago, but actually making sure that we see with everything that we that the impossible is possible and relishing in that and making new goals, setting new metrics of success, and attaining even smaller goals is one of the things that we are trying to adopt at USA Hockey through a lens of dreaming and thinking big. So I think that those kinds of values, they never leave you. But it is important to make sure that you're not boxing yourself in just so that you can grow as an organization.
Yeah. By the way, about thinking big, I mean, congratulations to the juniors men's team, you know, for just getting the gold medal.
Yes, yes.
Thrilling. For the Germans, it was also very good. Yeah. Unfortunately, not enough, but I mean, the best result we had in the juniors world championships. But also the women's team. I mean, they're always, yeah, almost all the time gold medalist. Yeah. And I mean, it's a huge thing. And so, I mean, hockey in particular, but I think all the sports, they have a challenge with, you know, getting more or younger people in, getting the youth to do the sports. How do you work with the youngsters, and how do you inspire also, for example, girls to join hockey?
Mhm. Yeah, well, it's kind of twofold at USA Hockey. You know, as we look at our own internal processes, which is more of a macro lens, we look at it as a way of how can we trickle some of those transformations down to a more micro lens, which for us is grassroots. So how can we look at either building new programs or reevaluating our existing programs to actually attract either underrepresented audiences or those audiences that are just simply not here yet. And so a lot of it is about looking at the data, right? How are our demographics shifting? Who is the next generation of the consumer? Who is the next generation of consumers' parents? Who are they? How do they make decisions? And so as we study those things closely, we're able to extract best practices from the behaviors of that next generation so that we can further build new programs or once again expand on previous programs so that we can be a welcoming space for that newcomer. And so that is the way that we are trying to approach diverse audiences, which whenever I say diverse audiences, I want to be very clear that those audiences, they include women and girls, they include people of color, they include the adaptive and disabled community, the LGBTQ community, the veteran community, so on and so forth, right? So that word diversity for us, it encompasses so many different kinds of backgrounds. And we're making sure that we are cognizant of all backgrounds so that we can meet the demands of what their communities want.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's very important. I mean, you know, we're so lucky that we are so diverse in the world, and it would be reflected everywhere more. I think we would probably live better together. Also, yeah. Well,
Absolutely.
I hope. But
Yes.
but coming back to brands also, I mean, you also work with a lot of brands at USA Hockey. So I think we've seen in the past 2 years, 3 years, a huge shift from brands and their engagement actually with women's sports, and after a number also of governing bodies and also brands, governing bodies, for example, World Rugby or UEFA, really started to boost, you know, the women's sports, and we see certainly also the shift in marketing campaigns and initiatives that, you know, women's sport can also be a standalone, and even, or I think once it is a standalone, it really also reflects its true value, what it has, you know, when it's not bundled in to something. And I mean, there were global campaigns in the past, you know, like World Rugby had that Try and Stop Us campaign. We had the WNBA Orange Hoodie campaign, you know, to tip off their season last year, which was a huge success, where also, you know, all the men were, yeah, helping to boost that, to help there. You have Sport England's, for example, with This Girl Can campaign. You have Budweiser's Lioness campaign. You have the BBC with Change the Game campaign, and obviously also Nike having quite a lot of campaigns out there with Drink Crazier and You Can't Stop Us. And so I think it's great to also see that, you know, women and social issues become or have a voice, you know, and that women, for example, are shown as strong and independent and successful, which they are. And so compared to brand messages we had in the past, where, you know, women were probably more a supportive act or a decoration tool for an ad, rather than really being in the center and the protagonists. It's the question, you know, how is your experience with brands also? I'm pretty sure that at USA Hockey, because you have a lot of brands also in your portfolio, which are helping to run USA Hockey. When you have interaction with them, do you see maybe that there is also a shift in their mindset, that they realize that they have to walk the talk more and really believe internally also in that matter in order to make a sustainable and good marketing campaign out of it?
You know, that's a good question. I think that it's important for all organizations to always gauge what their level of authenticity is. And I think that regardless of whether you have a brand that is working with your organization now or in the past or even in the future, I think that everything starts from within. So, you know, I know that for us, at USA Hockey, just within our own learning development, we're always asking ourselves, how can we be the most authentic hockey organization here in the United States of America? And so what I like to say about that is, for us, it's an evolving process. And sometimes we want to start with ourselves before we branch out and maybe start figuring or thinking about how we're contributing to the entire landscape of the sport, as well as how we contribute to brands. So that authenticity for us, it starts in-house, and it starts with us asking the right questions, so that we can come up with the right answers. And to be honest with you, Marisa, that is an evolving thing for us at USA Hockey, and we're coming up with those right questions and right answers every single day. So I don't totally have a clear-cut answer for your question, other than to say we are constantly talking about authenticity and how we can be authentic within the sport, especially by way of diversity and by way of inclusion. And we know that being authentic to diversity and inclusion, you can't do that without understanding where your lines of equity are. And so we know that brands are a part of our line of equity. However, just starting with our own selves internally and seeing how that inspires our work is really kind of where we are at USA Hockey right now. So I'm sure the whole brand piece will come, at some point in terms of that conversation. But right now we are really challenging ourselves to look at ourselves, as an organization. And so that's really where we've started those conversations.
Yeah, and I think that's important. I mean, you need to start with the basics, you need to reflect yourself. And I think everybody who did their or launched their own company, knows it begins with the, why do we exist, the famous Simon Sinek procedure. Yeah. And it starts with the own values. I mean, that's also what we did, for example, at She Sports. It took us quite some time also to identify, what are we, what do we want to be, and how do we want to be perceived, and what do we want to do. And I think, and that's probably something which also helped now in the times of COVID, that we have maybe more time to reflect on those things, and also seeing the outside pressure or the demands. Gen Z is not quiet for sure. They will tell you immediately when they don't think that's appropriate or the right way to go. And I think this is, I mean, it's super challenging, the time. I mean, 2020 was awful for sports. 2021 doesn't look any better so far, at least. But I think it also gives us the opportunity to advance, to challenge ourselves, to reflect our own mission and purpose, and to change, actually. And to, I mean, usually the calendars are so busy, it's really hard. And I mean, we've all been there, that you just go from task to task to task to task, event to event, and you have barely time to breathe. And suddenly there is time to breathe and to reflect. And you see your child. I have a daughter myself, you see your child more often, you also value that. And I think you're right about the authenticity piece. Just looked up some stats, and like 41% of consumers actually have stopped using or are using less of a brand that has a poor reputation or just is engaging in malpractice. And I mean, the most recent and hardest hit probably we saw was actually for the International Ice Hockey Federation, and the Belarus case, where actually sponsors put so much pressure on the federation. But it also shows that, the voices, even if it's just one voice, can become so loud, because due to social media and the whole engagement nowadays, messages are just quicker distributed, and they become like a wave. And this then also helps. I mean, sometimes it's a forced help, maybe, on federations, but I think more and more clubs and federations need to think now also, hey, is that sponsor maybe the right partner for us, or is that host city the right partner for us? And
absolutely. And I think with that whole authenticity piece, though, too, especially whenever you start talking about brands and their involvement with with a particular organization, I think organizations also have to be mindful about what their own identities are, right? So when you talk about brands attach themselves to a particular cause, right? Or when you kind of just spoke, Marisa, about what is your why, and that is the efficacy of your identity. And I think that if organizations, especially sport organizations, don't constantly investigate what their own identities are, then, like you said, the consumer is going to tell you who you are, and they're going to talk about who you are from their perspective. And that can have an adverse effect on your relationships with other brands. And so one of the things that I love about brands is that they help create a broader message, and they help link different backgrounds together. They help link different demographics together to a particular message, to a particular cause. And as you said, things are moving so rapidly with the newer generations that there is a demand for wanting to be closer to environmental issues, to be closer to social issues, and wanting to be closer to issues pertaining to governance. And so I know that with USA Hockey, we are thinking about those things as we fit into the hockey ecosystem. And once again, it goes back to those, if you're looking for the right answer, you have to ask the right questions. And so, you know, knowing too what the identity of particular brands can help sports organizations align themselves with brands that think and feel and do as they do as well. And I think that in sports, sometimes maybe we don't think about those things. Like maybe we think sometimes as a sports organization, well, we'll just wait until someone knocks on our door. But as we see, as the communities and the demographics are changing, you can't wait on that. Sometimes you do have to stand for something, and it starts within your identity. And so I kind of just wanted to throw that tidbit in there, because I think when you look at the statistics and you look at what the data says, sometimes sports organizations are not moving as quickly as that. And maybe sometimes they're not moving as quickly simply because they are reevaluating their identity. So I think a lot of times organizations, especially sports organizations, have to take a step back, stop, breathe. And like you said, 2020 was an opportunity for lots of different organizations, including USA Hockey, to really take that breather and look at what lies beneath our own identity, so that we can be authentic, and so that we can be better partners and align ourselves more strategically with other organizations that either do the same thing that we do or have the same value sets that we have. So those are all things that are very, very, very exciting. But at the same time, it does bring about a certain level of awareness, which is what brands actually look for whenever they're aligning themselves with other organizations.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a question here from the audience. Cindy Burwell actually wants to know, Stephanie, how did you start working in a diversity and inclusion role? Was it organic? Was it as in you evolved into this role based on work you were doing, or do you have a specific background or education in this area?
Yeah, actually, that's a good question, because I think what we know, at least here in the US, about diversity and inclusion is the discourse itself has people that have lots of different professional backgrounds. I don't want to call diversity and inclusion a niche kind of profession. However, I do look at it as a value add that can be added on to other professions. So for me, I have a background in business as well as I have a background in social work. So human behavior is very, very, very important to me. But I kind of just evolved into the discourse of diversity and inclusion. It was not something that I set out as an undergraduate student at Howard University as an English major. It wasn't something that I had said to myself, I'm going to work in diversity and inclusion. I think at that point, I didn't totally even know what it was. However, when I left college and I started working for different organizations, the question of how can one make room in their organizations became something that was paramount to me. And how can you make room basically meant when you walk into an organization that is just a homogenous group with a tremendous amount of groupthink, and no is thinking differently, no one looks different. It's like the same kind of person, the same kind of background, the same just atmosphere, and there's no synergy. And so that's when I became very aware that diversity and inclusion, as a profession and as a practice, is so important to break up the groupthink and break up homogenous offices and a homogenous way of thinking so that you can allow innovation to come into play. So my entry into diversity and inclusion was very much by way of working at an organization that wanted to know how can we be more innovative. And the answer to that was we need to be more diverse. We've got to have more people at the table that are not only making decisions, but that also reflect whatever that marketplace and the consumer base that you have for an organization. So I guess I would agree with you in saying that my entryway into diversity and inclusion was very organic. I will say that I didn't necessarily choose this. Rather, when I got my first job, like that's what I ended up doing, and so I kind of stuck with it. So yeah, so that was my background and how I got into this.
Yeah, no, really nice. And I think, I mean, also when we see, that topic, I mean, that's now you can study those kind of things, but back in the days, I mean, you just, evolved with it somehow, and you saw it. And I think what is always what you see is, I mean, sports is so diverse, and you touched upon the value sport has and the power also, I mean, which other cultural asset do we have which bands or combines so many different people, when you look at the figures from TV figures, etc., ratings from sport events, and seeing when you look in the stands, it is not only white women, white men as in most boardrooms nowadays. Yeah, it is much more diverse, and you think companies and federation clubs, they leave out a lot potential if they would be able to embrace diversity. And there are so many statistics out there and prove that diverse teams are more innovative, they make better decisions, the net profit is higher, because you actually, in the process of creating something, you already think about a lot of pitfalls internally, which if you have not a diverse group, you will realize once it's out there. And I mean, we have all seen also very bad marketing campaigns where you, or the first question you asked yourself, like, was it just men thinking about that now, or did they actually ask somebody else? But then on the other side, like, I think we are the same, if we're just with women, our topics are probably more female focused rather than also inclusive. And I think that's where the magic happens if you take everyone together. And you also said it's not just gender diversity, it is race, it is age. Yeah, I mean, I think we can learn a lot from those 16, 17, 18-year-old kids out there. I mean, they're, I can't, probably be as good as them when I look at Twitch or mobile games, etc. By the way, I also learned, and I didn't know that, just read it also, that you made a huge deal for the Women's Hockey League with Twitch, that it's streamed on Twitch, which is awesome, I think. I think, you have to go new ways, and linear TV is nice, but we also see, I mean, my daughter is 10 years old, and I only get her in front of the TV for news. Yeah, to watch news that she can go later to bed, and then probably to turn on Netflix or YouTube, and that's it. I mean, her main channels are YouTube, Netflix when it's a movie, and TikTok.
But you know what? I'm glad you brought up YouTube, because what I will say, as we're talking about brands, authenticity, identity, your why, I think that for a platform like YouTube, I think the reason why it is so successful is because it's real, right? Like, you can turn on YouTube any given time, you can find a recipe, you can find someone who's not even a chef, but cooks good meals, and you may identify yourself with that, right? And you can find and see real people doing real things. And so I will say, in terms of my work at USA Hockey, I do a lot of going out into the community, because once again, grassroots is really, really, really at the fiber and the fabric of everything that we do at USA Hockey. And one of the things that communities share all the time is representation, and can I actually be a part of that sport? And I will tell you, outlets like YouTube really show you, once again, that possible. You see lots of different people doing lots of different things that you maybe never saw do those things before. And so I can honestly say, for hockey, by way of diversity and inclusion, that is really what we're aiming for. We're aiming to attract those audiences that maybe initially didn't see themselves there, but but at the same time, that it is attainable for them, and they can be a part of this hockey community. And I will say, that's just one of the things that I absolutely love about you, because you can see real people doing real things, whether they're good at it, or whether they're trying it out for the first time, or whether they are just absolutely terrible at whatever they're doing on YouTube. That authenticity of showing what can be, or what is, and what is actually possible, is something that that folks want to see. So when you talk about that new generation, and the new generation is, they have an affinity for social issues, environmental issues. They want to know, what does an organization stand for? What do you stand for? Being able to be real and connected to people is something that folks want. And I think that all of us, especially in the sports space, we're trying to figure out how we can all bridge the identity of our organizations to be more real, more attainable, so that folks can know that they are welcome, even though you may not have seen yourself in this before. So that's one of the things that I do love about YouTube, because through YouTube, I get to learn how to do things that I've never done before. So it is about what is possible. So I just wanted to throw that in there about YouTube as you were talking.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We have another question from Johanna. It is, a lot of sports organizations are not very diverse yet, especially on the top management level. Do you think this change will slowly come from inside the organizations, or do you think there is more lobbying and consulting from the outside necessary? How can we best drive change?
I think it's going to be twofold. I think that there are some organizations internally that they are reevaluating their internal practices about how they can be more diverse at the top. But then there are some organizations that just simply don't know how to do that. They don't know how to have those conversations. And quite frankly, they may not know how to make room without them feeling like they have to be pushed out. And so I think that in cases such as that I just described, that is where you're going to need lobbying, you're going to need mandates, you're going to need legislation. And I'll tell you, here in the United States, even just with the state of California, they have created legislation that says organizations and companies have to have a certain percentage of racial diversity amongst their boards. And so, you know, in some ways, people don't want to hear that someone has had to be forced or made or mandated for a particular type of diversity to be included at the top levels. But sometimes that's just what it takes. But I think of the reason why I take that force and that push is simply because I think are misinformed. And once again, going back to that education piece, if people don't see where they fit into that equation of change, they become fearful. And then they start to think that diversity and inclusion is about them being pushed out so that somebody else can get a leg up. And that's really not what diversity and inclusion is about. But for those spaces and places and organizations that just can't get educated enough fast enough, that is where legislation and mandates and lobbying and policy change comes into play to hold people accountable. And so that we can actually see those key performance indicators that are going to be that are going to really help a place or an organization be successful. So to answer your question in short, I think it's twofold. And for those organizations that can look inside out and make the change on their own, kudos to them, because I do realize that can be a challenging truth for people to face. But for others that simply can't do it, the policy change, the lobbying, and the legislation kind of forces that push, because one way or the other, once again, with the demographical shift that we're seeing all across the world, a force will happen anyway. Yeah. It's just, when do you want it to happen?
Well, yeah. Are you pioneer, you know, and you're leading the movement, or are you lagging behind, you know, and just reacting to the movement? I think that's the thing. And I mean, you touched upon the change also, and I just read also the newest Mercer report, you know, revealed that while 81% of all surveyed organizations, for example, said they were focused on improving diversity and inclusion, or diversity, equity, and inclusion, but only 42% of them are actually having a multi-year documented strategy in place. And I think this is where you also see the difference. You know, if you want to walk the talk, you need to be stepping up, and you need to have long-term plans.
Yes.
With stepping stones in between, you know, with clear key performance indicators, which clearly show, okay, where do we want to be in 1 year? Where do we want to be in 3 years? Where do we want to be in 5 years? That you can actually see progress. And you mentioned data in the beginning also. I mean, it comes down to data. If you never measure what your diversity looks like in the company on all levels, then you won't improve anyways, because then you're just paying lip service probably to yourself. So the first step is really getting the data in, having a look at it, being honest with yourself that you just worked until that day like that, but now it's time to change and to join that movement and become a pioneer and help actually to get more people also inspired. There's another question, Stephanie. So how do organizations get to the bottom of their authenticity, given that it can't or certainly shouldn't be faked? how do brands and organizations discover what they're really about to get that to the market?
Yeah. I think that the first step is discovering and facing the truth of what people think, and I will tell you, I think that that is the most excruciating part for organizations, because perception is real and people don't like to own up to that. But if you are an organization and your brand says something about you that you think is wrong, then you've got to face what that thought process is and figure out how you can redirect the narrative of that. But I think what I've seen over the years is that people don't ever even want to own up to or acknowledge that that the organization is being shown in a particular light. And then executives become defensive and they say, well, we can't please everybody. And so I would like to say to that, no, you can't please everybody, but if you have a stigma attached to your organization, which is ultimately your brand, that is negative, you need to acknowledge that and immediately create an action item plan to redirect that narrative of what people see you as. Because those kinds of things will take an organization down. Sometimes it'll happen rapidly, but then other times it'll slowly fizzle out. So I think the first way to get to the bottom of that in your question is you have to face what the perception of your organization actually is, and you've got to acknowledge that, and then you investigate why your organization is being perceived that way. So we have to face the hard truths before we can create new truths, right? And that transformation lies in creating a new truth, but you can't get there until you acknowledge and accept the former truths that are there. So it starts with acceptance, it starts with acknowledgement, and it starts with investigating the whys of those perceptions. And then you can kind of shift the narrative of really what your organization stands for. So it starts there.
Yeah, no, that's true. And I think that's also very important, to see it that way. I mean, we all want probably quicker change sometimes, and I think actually the crisis also helped us to be more agile and to, adapt quicker. And I think this puts also a lot of mental challenges, I think, towards people who were not often in situations where they had to be agile and change a lot. I think I think in sports, or especially when you did sports, you know what it is and how it feels like to be in constant change mood and adaptation mode. But for many people, they're just not accustomed to it. Yeah.
And it starts with culture change, though, too, right? So I know we've talked about so much in terms of, authenticity, identity, branding, but it's a lot of this stuff is rooted in the culture. And if your culture doesn't change or transform, you stay the same. And so we have to understand that you've got to be in a space where you're willing to have the audacity to shift culture. And a lot of places and spaces don't want to do that. And Marisa, as you have pointed out, sports across every single sport is going through a culture shift, right? We all are going through culture shifts, no matter what the sport is. I think the difference is that maybe some sports are listening at the speed of the consumer base a lot quicker or faster than others are. And so we can't have a lot of these conversations without talking about what in the culture needs needs to change or needs to meet the demands, not only of this current generation, but of the generation in the next 10, 20, 30, 40, or 50 years. Because if you're not thinking about right now where your organization will stand in the next 20 years, you've already missed the boat. Because the next 20 years, in a lot of organizations, especially sports, they're having these conversations about that 20-year cycle now. And in the next 2 years, they're going to be about that 30, 40, and 50-year cycle. So culture change is a large part of that. And I think we hold steadfast to that, especially within sports, because it's one of the few industries that changes so quickly. And Marisa, as you and I talked about even before.
Your mic.
Okay, so even before we kind of got live, is that, sport changes so quickly, and the landscape of sport will change before front offices even change. And so, we have to be able to ride that wave. And like you said, it's not a moment, it is a movement. And it's something that is going to be an evolutionary effort and not revolutionary at all.
Yeah.
So we always have to remember those things.
Yeah. And I think also with the cultural topic, I mean, that's very important. What comes with it then is the structural topic, probably. I mean, because this is then followed actually by culture, because if you have a good culture, the structures are made more inclusive, they are recognizing certain things, certain biases probably, which have been there, but never been realized, and it's again, not about, pointing out things or pointing fingers up on people or structures, but just realizing, that it's a different era. And in order to, gain talent and attract talent, we need to adapt those structures as well, those policies. I mean, I think a big play is the succession planning, of board members, etc. How is it? How are presidents elected? These are all probably topics. I mean, it's often hard to talk about because nobody, want to say, well, you're not doing a good job, because that's really not what it's about. But it's about how do we bring the sport into a new way of being. I think everybody, or we need everyone's voice contributing with their views and points, and actually to elevate the sport business to new heights. And I think what I always think, I would be urging everyone to really continue to have confidence in diversity, in women's sports, in inclusion, because this is how we're going to continue to grow the sport in future. And that is what is needed.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think those are those harder conversations when you start talking about succession planning and attracting and retaining talent, and how you can help people advance outwardly and up instead of just advance up or advance down. And you're right, those conversations are difficult because folks look at it as, then that means you're saying I need to be out. And it's not about that. It's about making room for the next wave of the generation. And people have to acknowledge that sometimes, that next generation may not be what they are. And that is okay. It's definitely not a bad thing. But once again, that's where we have to go back to knowing, how are we going to be a part of this movement? And being authentic with that, and understand that you will make mistakes too.
Honestly,
it's a learning process, and it's definitely an evolving kind of thing. But but you have to have those types of transformations in
Mm-hmm.
your strategic plan and just in your set of core values. And if they're not there, you're not going to pay attention to them and you'll just stay the same. So I'm glad you brought that up because those are even harder conversations to have.
Yeah. There's another question from Cynthia. What do you think about sport teams rebranding for a better picture of themselves, reaching out towards their audience and fans, especially for teams in Eastern European countries where the acknowledgement of change comes quite hard, also due to economic issues? What would you suggest to do for faster and more impactful change?
I say move at the speed of your consumer base, but Marisa, I think you would probably have a better answer to that than me since you're actually in the European market. But just from an American market standpoint, if you're not changing with the marketplace and whatever that marketplace wants, needs, and demands, then you're going to be behind the curve.
Mm.
And so I would assume that same regiment would could carry over into other countries. But Marisa, you have a better forethought on what the European market is like. So I'm sorry, I can't really speak to that as much.
No, I think also that, I mean, it's important that you find your true value. I think a rebrand is nothing bad in particular. I think it can be done really well, but yes, you have to really listen to your audience. Who are you serving? In the end, we are serving either consumers, we're serving that people are spending their time, and I mean, time is the most valuable asset we have in life. And health. So like, do it for them and not for yourself. And I think that's very important. That you always, as you said, look to the consumer, look to your own values, reflect. I think that also takes a lot of time, and it's probably also not a linear process. I mean, we even realized that with ski sports, I mean, when different opinions or different people come into a room, there should be discussions about certain things, and allowing those discussions, having a safe place to phrase things. I think that is very important. That we're not in an autocratic world, mostly, luckily. Like, it's important that we have conversations, and that we also have those tough conversations, and it's not about blaming people, but it's trying to find the best solution for the given moment in time, because society develops. You mentioned sustainability. I mean, yes, we had sustainability topics already in the 80s, yet nobody spoke about it.
Yeah.
And now, because of a young girl, suddenly people dare to speak openly and publicly about it. And it's the same with the Black Lives Matter movement. It's the same with the Me Too movement. It's the same with all kind of movements. And we just have to acknowledge that our children and the Gen Z, they will speak up, and they will tell you also what you mentioned when they don't like it. Yeah. And but then the hardship is they will walk away because they have choice nowadays. It's not like there are 10 clubs out there, and well, either you're a German Bayern Munich fan or a Dortmund or Schalke fan. It is, there are hundreds clubs, and you don't have to be ruling for a German club. You can be fan of whatever club, and this also brings globalization. So we can create together a lot, but we also have competitors out there.
And not only do you have choice and you've got competitors, I think what today provides for that next generation is people can always find someone that values them. So one of the things that I know and that we know in the diversity and inclusion space is that the value of the person can be found in a lot of other places. And so people feel more confident these days, or the next generation feels more confident because they know, if you don't speak to me, I know where I can be spoken
Mm,
to.
mm,
So, I think that it's very clear to understand that emotional intelligence and that emotional connection, because even though there are competitors may not be able to emotionally connect with the consumer any better than you, or any better than any other product or brand or anything like that.
mm,
But at the same time, the new age consumer wants to be spoken to, and they want to know that they are valued,
mm,
and they know where they can find that. And I think that that is why, just from a brand perspective, you can see a lot of these smaller brands that you've never heard of.
mm. Yeah,
And then you might look at the Fortune 500 and be like, wow, I didn't know that
yeah.
brand was worth so much, simply because they have a whole marketplace that doesn't even ever expose themselves.
Mm, yeah.
Simply because it's fine for that consumer base to get what they need, and they don't ever have to promote themselves, they don't have to advertise, they don't have to do any of those things. And
Mm,
so, I think that that's thing that even millennials like myself, I don't think that millennials, we even mastered the fact that it is okay to walk away from something if it doesn't speak to you.
yeah.
But that generation after us, they know the
Yeah.
value in that. And like you said, they don't care. They will say, oh, you know what? That's just not for me. And I'll move on someplace. So emotional intelligence and connection, I think, is a
Mm,
really big part of that, because there are places and spaces and ways that you can emotionally connect. And if
mm,
you do that, you will have a consumer not only for their lifetime, but you will have their kids, their grandkids, their great grandkids. So that was just something that I also wanted to add to what you said.
yeah, absolutely. Stephanie, time is flying. We've talked now already an hour. Just maybe quickly. So, what would be like the key things you would like people to take away from this conversation?
Yeah. I think the key things that I would like people to take away from this conversation is that there isn't totally um, a right way for brands to be authentic. And whenever I say brand, if you are an organization or someone that offers something, you have a brand, you have an image. And I think to keep those things intact, and of course in demand, because that will help you be around for a long period of time, you have to have emotional intelligence, right? You've got to be able to connect with your marketplace and with your consumer base. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, you have to know what your identity is. You also have to know what your identity isn't, so that you can build an identity for yourself, and you can be unapologetic about that identity. And then the third thing is authenticity. I think that those three things are things that I really hope people can take away from this talk that we've had. Because if you're not authentic, you don't have an identity, and you don't know how to emotionally connect, and you don't have that intelligence, it's going to be difficult for an organization to
Mm,
survive the next 30 or 40 years.
mm, mm,
And
mm,
so I want people to also know that sports, while we love them, we love the games, on the back end, there's a whole business side of it that keeps this vehicle running. And if you don't understand those nuances of brand management, and once again, authenticity, identity, emotional intelligence, and if you're not thinking about it in a 10, 15, 20-year forward thinking lens, you won't survive.
mm,
So we want to make sure that in sport survives, because once again, it shows us what is possible every time we look at any game. And of course, for me, representing USA Hockey, for us in hockey, we know that we want to always be on that cusp of showing people that they can always achieve their goals and dreams. And so when you think about that, that's something that you want generations to come to know, that they can achieve their dreams, but there's also a place and a space within that sport and within the culture for them to do those things. So that's what I hope people will take away from our talk today.
Oh, I'm pretty sure they do that. Thank you very much, Stephanie, for your time. I know you're jet lagged, just coming from Hawaii, now back home in Dallas. I hope you stay safe. Yeah, I really thank you for that conversation, and I hope, yeah, we could inspire some other men and women out there in the sports business, and always happy to continue talks and conversations. I think it's important that we speak about those kind of things. And again, thank you very much, everybody, for listening in, for joining. And Stephanie, you take good care of yourself, and good luck for USA Hockey.
Thank you so much, and look forward to being in touch, Marisa.
Thank you. Yeah. Bye.
Okay. Goodbye.